Gandhiji's autobiography, My Experiments with Truth, shows how important truth and its pursuit was in Gandhiji's life. To see the truth of liberty of man actualized in the lives of Indians, he resisted colonial oppression and united modern day India despite persecution. Hence, Gandhiji held with great reverence the words of Jesus, who proclaimed, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." As Gandhiji labored to set us free from colonial invasion, Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life, sets us free from sin and death into true liberty and life. Let us call to remembrance these words of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount that Gandhiji memorized. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Wishing all our listeners a memorable Gandhi Jayanti to reflect upon the life and legacy of the father of our nation.
Well, hello. Welcome back to yet another episode of SAFT podcast. And it's been 2 weeks and we're back again. And with the monsoon creeping in, I know it has been bad at some places. It has been bad in Bangalore. But I hope that you're doing good, Jacob. How are you and how's the situation over there?
Oh, the monsoon has been. I'm getting to see Bangalore in its proper monsoon form for the first time now. Because when I came to Bangalore, it was by October, so I saw some rain, but nothing as serious as I'm seeing right now. You might have already seen in the news. We are recording this in the mid of
Yeah.
September, so the past 2 weeks there was rain left and right in Bangalore. You could see some of the best parts of the metropolitan city, some of the best IT parts of the city flooded. There was pictures of people sitting on the walkways and working on their laptops because they couldn't get to their IT offices. So it just shows you what nature in its, maybe in its very dialed down format can do to our best creation of infrastructure. Maybe not best. Maybe the people in Bangalore won't agree with me if I say the best infrastructure in Bangalore. But yeah, that's what I've been saying. How's it been in Calcutta for you?
Yeah, it's been good. But, I'd just like to let the audience know that though this episode is coming out today, but we had recorded it 2 weeks back. So when we mentioned past 2 weeks, it has been
Oh,
raining a
yes.
lot. So it's been during this period of time, okay?
Yeah, the
So don't
first
get
2 weeks of
confused.
September.
And or else they'll be like, okay, it's sunny in Bangalore, and why are these guys saying it's raining and it's so bad, right? So I don't want that to happen. Okay, keeping all this aside, let's straight off dive into today's topic. But
Yep.
before that, let me give a quick recap of what we spoke in the previous episode. And you all know that we have been talking about the Kalam cosmological argument, right?
Right.
And in last episode, we specifically spoke about J.L. Mackey and his three objections, and we responded to these three objections. And towards the end, we concluded that God is timeless without creation and in time with creation. Did I miss anything, Jacob? I think that was the gist of it, right?
Yeah. We in the last episode we were actually like you rightly said, we were talking about the relation of God and time, and we were looking at what J.L. Mackey said as his objections, and we were giving some counter Christian theological philosophical responses to that. And like you said, one way
Yeah.
to make sense of God and his relation to time is exactly like you said. God is without time prior to creation. When there is no creation, then time begins to exist with
Right.
creation, and then his by his nature he's present in every point in time. And that is a very sensible point to hold, and it matches up with what I've seen in theology, and also it's a very rigorous point to hold philosophically as well. So that's just the recap of what we did in the last episode, and I think it's time for us to move on, bid our farewell to
Yeah.
J.L. Mackey, at least for now, and move on to the next part.
Okay, so again, coming back to the Kalam cosmological argument.
Yeah.
Okay, Jacob, can you repeat what's premise one?
So premise one is, and I'm sure the audience have already by hearted by now, premise one is everything that begins to exist
Yeah,
has a cause.
definitely.
Even in
Yeah.
fact, it's there on my Tumblr. Yep, there's I don't know how well you can see. I hope you can see it there. The first one,
Oh, wow.
everything that begins to exist
That's
has a
nice.
cause.
That's nice. So you won't ever forget it,
I will
right?
never forget it.
Okay, so coming back to the Kalam cosmological argument, and as you mentioned, what the premise one was,
Yes.
I was wondering, is premise one a law of nature, or I mean, what exactly is this premise?
Yeah, that's a That's a very good question to ask. And understanding what exactly premise one is, like you said, is it a law of nature? It helps us to steer away from some quite misplaced, misunderstood objections to the kalam that will be brought up. So premise one is when we say everything that begins to exist has a cause. It isn't a law of nature. Now, what do we mean by a law of nature? Right? The laws of nature. Now, Piyush, as a science student, you obviously know this. The laws of nature are
Yeah.
gravitational force, the strong and weak nuclear force, and the electromagnetic force. These are what we refer to as, we call them forces of nature, and in them we see the laws of nature written through them. So when we say about the gravitational law, that is one of the laws of nature. And these laws of
Yeah.
nature are, I would say, in some intrinsic sense, in some inexplicable sense, or in some inseparable sense. Okay, that's the right way. In some inseparable sense, they are connected with the forces of nature. So we can study the gravitational force. We can detect gravitational waves, right? That is, wow. How do we even do that? But we can detect gravitational waves.
Yeah.
We are able to see about how a heavy object in space is able to bend the space curve and bring a dip in the gravitational waveform and all of that. So what I'm saying is these forces of nature, these laws of nature, talk about something that are in some sense tangible, that we can detect with mechanisms that we have created. But the premise one isn't a law of nature in that sense. The premise one is a metaphysical law, right? It is, to simply put it, it is quite similar to the law of non-contradiction, or the law of excluded middle, or the law of identity. These are philosophically understood laws of logic, right? The law of non-contradiction. We would apply the law of non-contradiction when we are talking about a star that exists millions of light years away. We would take that as our ground rule for interpreting the data that we are getting from the James Webb Telescope, and how we are bringing it terms with the Hubble telescope, and so on and so forth. So that gives us a very good idea about how these abstract, right, non-tangible law, metaphysical law, is still connected to reality. Right? It is not something that just the philosopher engages in. As a scientist also, when you're trying to make sense of the data that you find in the real world, you expect it to be non-contradictory. And if it contradicts, you then move it to the side, or you somehow try to explain it in some other sense, because you still assume that it shouldn't be contradictory. If this is the data I'm getting from reality, it shouldn't contradict each other in that sense. It shouldn't say A and not A at the same time. So in that same sense, the premise one is a metaphysical law. It concerns everything with reality.
Okay. Wow. I think that's pretty clear for all of us. For me, it was clear, and I'm sure it's clear for the audience as well. So now we know what the premise one exactly is. Now, okay, I'll move on to my next question for you today, right? So I was just wondering, like, when we look around, we see that there are different things, and all these things begin to exist because they have a cause, right? All the things
Yeah.
which begin to exist, they have a cause. Now, premise one, it says that everything that begins to exist has a cause, and that is all the things which we see in the universe.
Right.
Now, how can we make the universe as a whole subject to this? Right? It's like saying that, okay, every sheep has a mother, so the herd has a mother.
Right.
You getting my point?
Yeah, yeah.
So can you put in some clarification on this?
Yeah. So and that's a good example to use. That's a good, it's actually very good wordplay to bring out what the objection is all about. When you say every sheep has a mother, there, but how can you say that therefore the herd has a mother?
Yeah.
And if I recall right, this is one of the logical fallacies in thinking, one of the logical errors in thinking, called fallacy of composition, where you have different parts and these individual parts have characteristics. So when you bring it together, you're trying to say that this new thing, which is a combination of all the parts, therefore has all the characteristics of that sort. So they say it's a fallacy of composition. You can't do that. But there are some instances where that actually does work, right? Let me rephrase this sheep herd thing in another way. Every sheep has a shepherd, and therefore the herd has a shepherd. Does that make sense? Yeah, that makes sense. Like if you pick out a herd that has a shepherd, you can point that each one of these sheep has a shepherd. Yeah, there is a shepherd. The herd, which is made up by all of the sheep put together, also has a shepherd. So it works in some instance, but doesn't work in some other instance. And coming back
Okay.
to the core of the objection, right? When you said, we say that when we say premise one, we apply that to everything within the universe. How can you say that it applies to the universe as itself? Which is what I initially mentioned when it's a good question that you asked. What is premise one? Is a law of nature of sort. We're talking about a metaphysical law, right? And because it concerns all of
Yeah.
reality, because it is applicable to all of reality, the universe is reality. When we say about the universe, we're talking about this space-time reality that we are part of, the space-time fabric, the space-time continuum that we exist in,
Okay.
as you want to put it in some complex terms. So therefore, it isn't subject to some things within the universe. It applies to reality as a whole itself. So that is the first point.
Yeah.
Like when we mentioned about the law of non-contradiction, can you say like the universe exists and doesn't exist at the same time? You would say no, that's a contradictory statement. But you are
No.
applying
Yeah.
a law of logic, a metaphysical law that you normally apply to things within the universe, to the universe as a whole. Now, what does that mean? It means that you're talking about not purely materialistic laws of nature or force of nature that came into existence with the beginning of the universe. You're talking about thing that applies to reality as we know it. And one point to sort of add to it, there's a couple of points in my mind. I'm trying to pull them together. Yeah. So this is the one point I'll mention. When we say the universe began to exist, we aren't talking about one piece of block that began to exist, right? When we say the universe began to exist, we're talking about that space, time, and matter came into existence. That's like we
Yeah.
mentioned in the previous episode also. Stephen Hawking saying that time itself must have a beginning. And if a point we
Yes.
come to a realization that, if let's say we come to a realization that space never began to exist, then scientists won't go around saying the universe began to exist. They would reframe it. They would break it down and say time began to exist, but space has always been here. Why would they break it down? Because when we say the universe, we're talking about space, time, and matter put together. We're using
All
the
of it
term
together.
universe. Yes, we're using the term universe to refer to all of it. That is what is basically happening there. So when we say
Yeah.
the universe began to exist, in other words, we are saying that space, time, and matter came into existence a finite time ago. Right? They weren't here eternally. So if space, time, and matter
Yeah.
had a beginning, then they must have a cause. So instead of saying space,
Right.
time, and matter, we just use the collective term universe to refer to reality. We refer to reality as we know it. We refer to space, time, and matter in that collective term. So it is. It needs some clarification, but as soon as you get this clarification, you see that the objection doesn't hold.
Yeah, I think it's really good. It was such a simple thing, but then when we put our heads into it, it's like it gets a bit confusing.
Yeah.
But thank you for telling us about that. And definitely, like, you have answered to our question. Okay, we all know about this famous atheist philosopher, right? Daniel Dennett. Now, in his book, Breaking the Spell Religion as a Natural Phenomenon, he mentioned this quote, which I'll be quoting. He said that everything that exists has a cause. Then what caused God? Right? So I'm sure that many of us have this question. It pops up in our heads, and people do come and ask us about this question. So how do we tackle this? How do we respond to this?
Yeah, this question of what caused God, right? The question of does God have a beginning? This is a question that is, inseparably. There is another word I'm trying to pronounce. I think I keep on mistaking it. I think I'm trying to say inextricably, but I don't know if that's the right word. So I'm just keeping that aside. Inseparably, right? This question of God beginning to exist, the beginning of God is inseparably tied to the Kalam cosmological argument, because we're talking about the beginning of a universe. And when we looked at J.L. Mackey's objection
Yeah.
also, right? He said, okay, if you say God began to exist at some point in time, then you can say the same thing about the universe. If you say the universe has been, began to exist, then the same thing applies to the God. So you see that this question is tied one way or the other through some objection to the Kalam.
Yeah.
And for that matter, we will be looking at this in depth when we go further in the series, especially when we get
Yeah.
into further details of the Kalam and we look at other arguments that address this question. But you see, Daniel Dennett's quote, right? Piyush, can you just read out the first part of the quote again?
Yeah, it said that everything that exists has a cause.
Right. Now, is that premise one? Is that what premise one says?
Nope.
Premise one says that everything that begins to exist has a
Begins
cause.
to exist. Yeah.
Right. So here's a key thing to keep in mind. I have the burden to prove a claim that I make. right? If I make the claim that everything that begins to exist has a cause, then obviously I have the burden to prove that. But neither any Christian who holds on to the Kalam cosmological argument, or for that matter, any Muslim who talks about the Kalam cosmological argument, the argument doesn't say that everything that exists has a cause. The argument says everything that begins to exist has a cause, which means that this question doesn't even concern us. It is not meant for us. It is meant for someone who says everything that exists has a cause. So the way to respond to this would be, the first part would be to point out that this is a misstating of the Kalam cosmological argument. This is a misstating of premise one. This doesn't concern me because this is not a statement that we have made. So that's clear. And because this talks about, because premise one talks about things that begin to exist, if you posit that God never began to exist, then he doesn't need a cause, right? And that is quite straightforward. And I think there is this other quote by Dennett that I'm recollecting to mind, where he refers to God, where he refers to a timeless being, and he says that it doesn't need an explanation. What needs an explanation of its existence, like beginning to exist as such, would be the concrete universe itself. I think I'll pull up the quote on screen right now to be sure. Here's the quote. And so as you see here, Dennett is admitting that it is the universe, the concrete universe itself, because it has a beginning to exist, that demands an explanation as to how it is here, why it is here, and so on and so forth. A timeless being, as Piyush mentioned about God's nature, a timeless being doesn't concern itself with this question. And like I said, it's something that we will look down in depth later on, clearly answering, does God have a cause? But here's one quick answer. The Christian position and the position that we will see at the end of the Kalam cosmological argument is that God never began to exist, which means that it is like trying to explain a round circle. I mean, a round square, a circle square. It is equivalent of trying to explain it when you try to explain what is the cause of God who never began to exist. Well, if he never began to exist, then he doesn't have a cause. So you're asking what is the cause of God who doesn't have a cause? Well, I mean, we don't have to take any more second to show out how absurd it is.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, that's why, I've heard some people, they say that why don't we make life easy and, adjust premise one to say that everything that exists has a cause. Because, like everything around us has a beginning and no physical thing we see around us is eternal, right? But then this is the point why we, the premise one adds those two words, that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Nevertheless,
I
think
that is actually a good point to point out, and I think I'll just quickly add on to that while we come to the end.
Okay.
You're right. Everything within the universe, like whatever we see, is not eternal. Right? It begins to exist, and then at some point it ceases to exist. The case with you, me, things that we see around us. So if things aren't eternal, if everything that we see here obviously begins to exist, then why don't we modify it to say everything that exists has a cause? Because you've already considered that everything has a beginning, that nothing here is eternally here. The reason we don't say that everything that exists has a cause is because we run into an issue of where we keep on going back into the past without an end, right? It is sort of like it is equivalent of someone trying to trace back where it all began. If you say that everything that exists has a cause, okay, I exist. What is my cause? My parents exist. What is their cause? My grandparents. You keep going back and you come to the point, okay, let's, just to put it simply, the planet Earth is the cause for life beginning to exist, right? I'm not going to get into the creation, evolution dialogue here. That's not the point. But to get to the analogy. So, okay, so what is the cause of the planet Earth? Oh, okay, well, it's all of these particles coming together and the planet Earth forming within the galaxy. Okay, so the particles within the galaxy are the cause. What is the cause of the galaxy coming together? Oh, it's these explosions, stars dying down, and heavy elements all coming together, yada, yada, yada. That's what caused it. Okay, so what caused that? We keep on going back, and turns out that we just keep on going back infinitely. And this is what we call as infinite regression. You are regressing. You're not progressing. Progressing is moving forward. Regressing is going backwards. So you're regressing infinitely. Infinite regression. Where you keep asking what caused this, what caused this, what caused this. Sort of like a domino effect. That is not stopping. That is going back. Like you're taking a video of a domino effect and you're playing it from back to start. From the last clip to the first clip. The issue is, it is an infinitely long clip. Why? Because every domino must be preceded by another domino. Because you're saying that everything that exists has a cause. So if this thing exists, it must have a cause. Well, this thing also exists. So then it must also have a cause. Well, that thing also exists. So that also should have a cause. You keep going back,
Yeah.
which means that we never actually start. Because you have to start with the first domino that is falling for the entire chain of cause and effect to be in motion. But if you
Yeah,
hold
yeah.
that everything that exists has a cause, then everything that exists must keep on going backward until we find where that first cause is. But if that first thing also exists,
Right.
then that should also have a cause. So you never get to the first uncaused cause, which is the reason why
Yeah,
we
it's
don't say
like
that.
yeah, it's like you just imagine of the largest domino effect in the world. You can go onto YouTube, you can find many videos, but then this is a domino effect which doesn't end. It goes on and on and on.
Yeah, no, it's
Right.
actually a domino effect that doesn't start. That's the thing. That's interesting detail to keep in mind, right? We are in the present now, and we're looking back into what happened in the past, right? We're tracing back the
Yeah.
cause and effect process. So it turns out it's a domino effect that doesn't start, which adds to the absurdity of it. Now, in the series, we will look at why the
Okay.
universe hasn't been here forever, why the universe cannot be infinite time, infinitely eternal in the past, all of that. In that, we will see the absurdity of this position. We're not talking about something that doesn't end. That is fine. You can keep going on into the future. You're telling about something that doesn't even start, but we are here. So how did this cause and effect thing start? Who kicked the first ball? Who set the things in motion in the first place? Who moved the first? Who made the first move? And this just which domino made the first fall? You're demanding that every domino must have a domino before it. So which is the domino
Yeah.
that starts falling? Which is the domino where the whole equation starts? That is why we don't say that everything that must have a cause. We say that everything that begins to exist has a cause. And that connects into saying again the point that if God never began to exist, then he doesn't have a cause. It connects to the universe as well. The way to defeat the Kalam cosmological argument is to say that the universe never began to exist. Then premise 1 doesn't apply to the universe. You could say that everything that begins has a cause, the universe never began to exist, therefore the universe doesn't have a cause. It works. I
Yeah.
hope I didn't make any logical fallacies in that, but you get the gist. It's immediately thought out. So the point of things that beginning to exist must have a cause applies however you want to take the argument. So if the universe never began to exist, then it is irrational to demand a cause for it. If God never began to exist, it is equally irrational and absurd to demand a cause for God. But yeah, like I said, we will look into it in much more depth. Again, slow, bite-sized, paced down the line. So I think this is a good place to, like you said, Piyush, call the curtains on this episode.
Yeah, right. I think we have crossed our 20 minutes mark, and
Yeah.
we try to keep our episodes bite sized so that we all can grasp something. So it's short and helps us to understand. And I think it's a good time to stop, and we'll see you again in the next episode. Till then, do follow us on our social media pages. And if you have any questions and you want to get featured, you want your question to be featured, you want your voice to be featured on this episode, you can use the link below. It's called SpeakPipe. You can use that, and it will be pretty cool, right? So that everyone around can hear you asking your question, your audio coming up. And so do make use of that. Apart from that, if you want daily updates, monthly updates, you sign up to our newsletters, so that every month when we send out newsletters, you'll be able to rejoice along with us about what God has been doing through this ministry and through us. That's it from our side. Stay safe, and see you in the next one.